I've been looking at Abbe Reynolds' passage um, about the nature of the modern state and the nature of modern notions of the order and authority and all other things related to it. So far we have looked at a few things. Let's go over them again. So far what we have looked at is that the modern state is based on the idea of the general interest. So we learn from the passage that the general interest is the rule of everything which should subsist in this state. So everything which subsists in this state, its institutions, and also society, because society is structured by state, is governed by general interest. That's the first thing. The second thing is general interest is practically speaking in the previous sessions we looked at how this is the case, so I'm not going to go over it again, but general interest in general interest in practice is the interest of capital in general. The interest of accumulation in general. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation, that's what capital is. So that means that the modern state is governed by the logic of and the dictates of capital accumulation. And although it says that the people or the sovereign has the right to determine what is general interest, but if you adopt the paradigm of interest, at least in the historical context in which we are talking about, there is no other, at least in the long run, there is no other meaning of interest except capital or accumulation. Because whatever your interests are, they are basically material interests. Or even if there are spiritual interests, they are understood in this context. And in order to fulfill your interests, you need resources. And the way resources are accumulated in the modern society is through capital accumulation. So, although in theory, people determine what the general interest is, in practice, it is nothing else but the interest of the interest of capital accumulation. That's the practical manifestation of your adherence to or allegiance to the notion of general interest. And this is because when people dedicate themselves to desires and their fulfillment, whether at the level of individual or at the level of society, in the long run it is desire which they follow, not the other way around. That's just the logic of the desires. And this sovereignty of desire is another name for the sovereignty of another name for the sovereignty of the interest. So the modern order is based on the idea of general interest, and the general interest basically means the interests of capital. So in modern state, only those things can subsist or exist which are conducive to the interests of capital, or at least are not hindrance. So anything which actually challenge or potentially challenge or threaten the sovereignty of capital is squashed, is destroyed in this idea of the modern state. And in that sense, the modern state is a totalising state, in the sense that both the individual, society, and the state, they all should be subservient to the interests of capital in general. So that's much we had covered last time. So this much we had done. The general interest is the rule of everything which should subsist in this state. And the people or the sovereign in which the authority is invested alone has the right to judge. So this is totalising power, exclusive power, absolute power, which in theory belongs to the sovereign or the people, but in practice it belongs to the capital, as we saw. Alone has the right to judge of any institutions within the state, within the society, whatever, whether it conforms to the general interests. So it is in the power. The function of the state is to look at each and every institutions and make sure that none of them are at least inimical to or threat to the sovereignty of capital. And in this sense, in this context, religion becomes important historically, because capital became a dominant power in societies in which accumulation was regarded as something, a dedication to accumulation for the sake of accumulation, whether at the level of individual or society or the state, was regarded frowned upon. And the values so avarice and covetousness were condemned in the Christian civilization of the Middle Ages. In that society, a transformation occur over hundreds of years, and one of those part of that transformation was that this worldliness became acceptable first, and then it became a dominant or an ideal force in the life of the civilization. And for that to happen, certain conception of religion must give way to certain other conception of religion. So the Catholic religion, or as it stood in the medieval civilization, late Middle Ages, universal must be transformed, or if it cannot be transformed, it must be destroyed. And one way this religion was transformed was through Protestantism in certain part. But where Protestantism wasn't successful, this transformation took the form of the compromise by the Catholic Church on its dogmas and on its worldview, in the sense that it accepted the sovereignty of this new state. So a religion like Protestantism was acceptable because it condoned this worldliness. Also, it doesn't contest the absolute sovereignty of the modern state. In fact, Protestantism was developed and became successful with the help of those national states, absolutist national states. But traditional Catholic religion was a problem for two reasons. First, it didn't accept the sovereignty of the state absolute sovereign, because for Catholic religion, the absolute sovereignty belonged to God or the Church of God in practice. That's one thing. Second thing is the otherworldliness and the condemnation of avarice and covetousness and this worldliness, at least in theory. So these two things. And so in order for the success of the modern totalising state, this church or this religion must give way, at least by transforming itself, by conceding the full sovereignty to the state, and at least by that way accepting, at least in practice, the right of the state to determine everything, the individual, their education, their dominant values and the social values, and everything which it thinks is in the interest of the capital accumulation. So such religion either must be destroyed if it doesn't peacefully succumb to transformation. And this is what happened over 200-300 years since 16th century to 1950, 60, and it's going on. But basically, Catholic Church gave way, conceded in in waves of, reform agendas, the absolute authority of the modern state, and it doesn't. And today, for example, the problem with Islam and the modern state is the same, because Islam doesn't concede, at least not in theory, this absolute sovereignty. So it doesn't concede the absolute sovereignty of God, His law. That's why, see, there's a whole debate about reforming curriculum, Islamic religious curriculum, and all that thing. So it is in this context that we should read the next paragraph. So, the people or the sovereign power in which the authority is invested alone has the right to judge, the totalising, exclusive right to judge of any institution, whether in society or state, and specifically whatever, any institution, whether it conforms to the general interest or not. And if it doesn't conform to the general interest, it makes sure that it does, or it is totally destroyed. And these are Charles Taylor's words. In the ensuing discussion, you may explain what kinds of dangers he fears that religion might pose to this order, that is, this absolutist, totalizing state. And this state is totalizing, whether it takes the form of liberal state or socialist Marxist state or nationalist state. In its nature, in its basic position, it's all totalizing. Obviously, when a religion is transformed, then its relation to that religion becomes more relaxed. People and that makes people think that, for example, liberalism is more soft on religion. That's not true. It's soft on only a religion which it has fashioned itself. It is not soft on religions which pose threat to this. It's absolutist, totalizing right and power. So that's what I say. So it is that set authority, self. It is this authority and this authority only. It pertains to this authority, this state, and to this authority alone. That's exclusivity and totalizing nature, to examine the dogmas and disciplines of religion. So modern secularism is totally different from secularism, where there's a part belongs to the state and part belongs to the religion. Now, within the modern political order, the general interest, the interest of capital, is totalizing, and the religion is given certain freedom only within that overall authority, and only on the condition that it accepts that authority, and it succeed its pretensions to that authority. So it pertains to this authority and this authority alone to examine the dogmas and disciplines of religion. So saying that it doesn't interfere in people's individual religious and spiritual matters is wrong. It doesn't interfere as long as it thinks that those interests are subservient to its own interest and are not threat to its own interest. But as long as they become threat to, or are perceived to be threat to, then those private matters, religious matters, spiritual matters, all become, fair game for this state. It doesn't matter whether it's a liberal state or a practical strategy can be different, because that That pertains to the perception what is effective, not what is legitimate and what is not legitimate. So it pertains to this authority and this authority alone to examine the dogmas and disciplines of religion, as they're doing with Islam today, and they did with Catholicism before, to make sure that, contrary to common sense, they would not expose peaceful order to disturbances. Peaceful order mean the order in which the right to violence or the means of violence or legitimate violence or belong only to the state. That's what peaceful order means. So they would not expose peaceful order to disturbances made all the more dangerous by the fact that dogmatic ideas of a happiness to come, that is paradise, are combined with the zeal for God's glory and the submission to truths that are regarded as revelation. So I think I missed some. So these dogmas, they are dangerous because they focus people's attention to the other world and happiness in the other world, everlasting happiness rather than the fleeting happiness of this world. They try to establish the glory of God, that is the sovereignty of God, and they call for submission to the truth rather than to desires, and they base their views on the superiority of revelation. Such dogmas, unless they can compromise these ideas and make it compatible with the authority of capital in general, they can be allowed to live. Otherwise, if they don't compromise with any of these things, and if they are danger to the authority of capital, then they must be destroyed. And this view is not just of Abirinal or Diderot, but also of the liberal philosophers, like the greatest of the modern liberal philosophers, like John Rawls, for example, in his political liberalism. So what this proves is that the modern secularism doesn't allow religion to exist alongside the state, and the modern state is not a laissez-faire state. It becomes laissez-faire only when everything succumbs to its absolute authority. It's an absolutist and totalising state, and it allows religion only to the extent that it is compatible to the sovereignty of the capital in general. If it is not compatible with the sovereignty of capital, if it is danger to the sovereignty of capital, those religion cannot exist. Those religion must be destroyed by hook or crook. So, and we'll stop here and we'll continue with this.